Have you ever walked into a place knowing exactly what you were looking for, only to be met with cold stares and dismissive attitudes? Have you ever felt like you didn't belong somewhere just because of the way you looked now? Imagine stepping into a five-star hotel not as a guest, but as the secret new owner. What would you do if the very people working for you didn't even give you the respect of a second glance? That's exactly what happened when Keanu Reeves dressed like any other regular guy walked into the prestigious Regent Crown Hotel in downtown New York, a place known for its exclusivity, its elite clientele, and unfortunately a staff that had grown a little too comfortable making assumptions about who was worth their time. But tonight things were about to change, and one woman was going to learn a lesson she'd never forget. Stay with me, because by the time we reach the turning point in this story, you might just find yourself questioning how often you've made a snap judgment without realizing it. And if you've ever experienced something like this where someone assumed you didn't belong, drop a 1 in the comments. Let's see how many of us have been through it. The Regent Crown Hotel was the kind of place where the wealthy came not just to stay but to make a statement. High ceilings draped in crystal chandeliers, velvet-covered furniture, arranged with meticulous precision, and uniformed staff who walked with an air of superiority, as if they were just as important as the billionaires they served every detail in. This hotel screamed luxury, from the scent of ported mahogany lingering in the lobby to the soft jazz playing in the background. But in a place where image was everything, first impressions meant more than reality. And unfortunately, that rule applied to both guests and employees alike. It was a chilly autumn evening when a man stepped through the revolving glass doors. He carried no designer luggage. No expensive watch glinted on his wrist, and his dark, slightly unkempt hair fell just below his collar, dressed in a simple hoodie, worn-out jeans, and a backpack flung over one shoulder. He looked nothing like the hotel's usual guests, the kind who arrived in black SUVs with assistants trailing behind them, but the moment his boots touched the plush marble floor of the lobby, the entire atmosphere shifted. Conversations at the front desk slowed. Subtle side glances were exchanged, and one of the concierges whispered something to another. It wasn't outright hostility, just a quiet mutual understanding that this man was likely in the wrong place. At the center of it all stood Victoria Sinclair, the hotel's senior manager. She was a woman who prided herself on efficiency, on keeping things running smoothly, above all on maintaining the Regent Crown's reputation for exclusivity. She had seen the type before walk-ins, who wandered in out of curiosity, mistaking the hotel for something within their reach. Usually they were harmless, a quick redirect to another establishment was all it took to send them on their way. But something about the way this man carried himself was different. There was no hesitation in his step, no sign of uncertainty as he approached the front desk. Still, Victoria was certain he didn't belong here, clearing her throat. She stepped forward, flashing the kind of professional yet distant smile perfected through years. "In hospitality, excuse me, sir," she said, her tone polite but clipped. "Can I help you?" Keanu met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I'd like to check in," he said, simply. Victoria arched a brow, resisting the urge to glance at the uniformed doorman as if confirming whether he had let someone in by mistake. "I see," she said, her smile remaining in place. "And do you have a reservation with us?" Keanu nodded, reaching into his pocket to retrieve his phone. "Yeah, under the name Reeves." Victoria didn't even glance at the system. She had dealt with situations like this before, and she knew how to handle them quickly. Her job wasn't just to assist guests. It was to maintain the exclusivity of the hotel, to ensure that its reputation remained untarnished. If someone didn't belong, it was her responsibility to guide them elsewhere. And right now, the man in front of her didn't belong. She sighed, tilting her head slightly as if speaking to a child who had gotten lost. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "I think there's been some kind of mistake. Rooms at the Regent Crown start at $3 a night, and we don't typically accept walk-in reservations for the first time." Keanu's lips curved into a small smile, though there was no amusement in his eyes. "That's okay," he said, sliding his phone back into his pocket. "I don't mind the price there." It was that quiet moment of hesitation. Victoria had dealt with self-assured types before, people who thought that confidence alone could get them into places they had no business being. She wasn't rude, not exactly, but there was an edge to her tone now, a subtle shift in her posture as she leaned against the desk, crossing her arms. "I'm sure you don't," she said, her voice laced with polite condescension, "but our clientele is pre-approved, and we have a very specific screening process. Perhaps there's a different hotel that might be more suited to your needs." Keanu studied her for a moment, but if her words had offended him, he didn't show it. Instead, he simply nodded, letting out a quiet breath. "Interesting," he murmured. Victoria mistook his reaction for understanding. She reached into a drawer, pulled out a small printed list of nearby hotels, and slid it across the desk toward him. "I'd recommend these," she said, flashing her signature customer service smile. "They're a little more accessible." Keanu picked up the list, scanning it briefly before setting it back down. Then, with the kind of casualness that almost felt too deliberate, he asked, "Mind if I speak to the owner?" Victoria blinked for a split second. She thought she had misheard him. "The owner," she repeated, laughing lightly. "Oh, that won't be possible. The owner doesn't take meetings with guests, especially not unannounced." Keanu chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "No?" he asked, pulling out his phone again. "That's too bad. I think he'd want to meet me." Before Victoria could respond, Keanu pressed a button on his phone. The call was brief, just a few words exchanged before he hung up and slipped the device back into his pocket. Victoria was about to dismiss him again when the doors to the private elevator at the back of the lobby suddenly opened. Stepping out was Richard Morgan, the hotel's senior executive, his usually composed expression replaced by one of pure shock. And as he strode across the marble floor toward them, every member of the staff stopped in their tracks, watching as the moment unfolded. "Mr. Reeves," Richard called out, his voice carrying through the lobby. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." The color drained from Victoria's face as realization struck. Like a bolt of lightning, her breath caught in her throat as Richard extended a hand toward Keanu, his entire posture shifting to one of deference and respect. The man she had just dismissed, insulted, and all but thrown out of the hotel was the owner. In that instant, the room seemed to close in on her, and for the first time that evening, Victoria felt completely, utterly out of place. And this, my friend, is where things get really interesting. What do you think happens next? If you're ready for part 2, let me know by dropping a 1 in the comments, because trust me, you're going to want to hear what comes next. For a moment, silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The weight of the moment pressed down on Victoria Sinclair as she struggled to process what had just happened. Every fiber of her being told her she had made an irreparable mistake. But she wasn't the only one feeling the tension. The entire lobby, from the front desk clerks to the bellboys, seemed frozen in place, their gazes shifting between Keanu and Richard Morgan, the hotel's senior executive who had just addressed him with nothing short of reverence. Keanu Reeves, the man she had just dismissed as an unworthy guest, wasn't just someone with money, he was the owner. Victoria felt her pulse quicken, her throat tightening as she forced herself to maintain composure. Years of experience had trained her to handle difficult situations with grace, but this was something else entirely. She had humiliated the new majority stakeholder of the Regent Crown Hotel, treated him like some wandering tourist who had mistakenly stumbled into the wrong place. Richard, on the other hand, looked anything but uncomfortable. If anything, his demeanor was one of barely concealed panic. As he extended his hand toward Keanu, his voice laced with urgency. "Mr. Reeves, we hadn't expected you so soon," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "Had we known you'd be arriving tonight, we would have made arrangements." Keanu didn't immediately take Richard's hand. Instead, he glanced at Victoria, then back at the senior executive, his expression unreadable. There was no visible anger, no grand display of indignation, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet, measured disappointment that somehow cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. "I like to keep things spontaneous," Keanu said finally, his voice calm. "Even gives a chance to see how things are actually running when no one's putting on a show." Victoria felt her stomach drop. Richard forced an uneasy chuckle, rubbing The back of his neck, that's certainly one way to do it. He admitted, his eyes darting toward Victoria for a brief second, before settling back on Keanu. I assume you've already had a chance to, experience our level of hospitality. Keanu tilted his head slightly. You could say that the subtle shift in Richard's ration told Victoria all she needed to know. He was aware that she had turned Keanu away, aware that she had treated him like an outsider, aware that she had failed in the most public and humiliating way possible. It was a rare thing for Victoria Sinclair to feel small. She had built her career on poise, confidence, and authority. She had climbed the ranks of the Regent Crown with a level of ambition that outpaced most of her colleagues, securing her position as senior manager of one of the most prestigious hotels in New York. Bootwright. Now, as Keanu Reeves studied her with that same quiet intensity, she felt like she had been stripped down to nothing. I believe we owe you an apology. Richard continued, hastily stepping in to try and salvage the situation. And of course, we'd like to offer you. Keanu raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. No need for that, he said, his voice still carrying that unsettling calm. I'm not there to make a scene. I just wanted to see how things were run, and now I have a better idea. Victoria could feel the beads of sweat forming at the back of her neck, though she remained perfectly still. She knew what was coming next. Let and get everyone. Together, Keanu continued, his gaze flicking between Richard and Victoria. I'd like to have a conversation with the staff. It wasn't a request. Richard nodded quickly, of course. Sire, right away. Within minutes, the entire hotel staff had been gathered in one of the grand conference rooms, an opulent space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. The murmur of hushed conversations filled the room as employees exchanged uncertain glances, trying to figure out why they had been called in so abruptly. The tension was palpable at the head of the room stood Keanu, flanked by Richard on one side and Victoria on the other. Victoria's usual confidence had been replaced by something far more subdued. Her hands clasped in front of her gaze fixed downward. Keanu took a moment before speaking, his eyes scanning the faces before him. When he finally addressed them, his voice was clear, steady, not harsh, but carrying enough weight to command attention. For those of you who don't know me, he began, I'm Keanu Reeves, and as of recently, I'm the new majority stakeholder of the Regent Crown Hotel. A ripple of surprise swept through the room, the realization that they had been in the presence of their new boss without even knowing. It sent a wave of unease through the staff. Keanu continued, I came here tonight unannounced, without security, without an entourage, without the usual theatrics. He said I wanted to see firsthand what kind of experience someone would have if they walked into this hotel as just another guest, and I did. He let that hang in there for a moment before continuing. Now, don't get me wrong, I get it. You work at a high-end establishment, you're used to a certain type of clientele. But that doesn't mean we get to decide who's worth treating with respect and who isn't. The room remained silent. Keanu glanced at Victoria, not out of malice, but as a way of reinforcing the moment. She swallowed hard, but said nothing. This isn't about me. Keanu continued, I don't need special treatment. I don't need to be recognized, but what I do need is to know that this hotel, the one I now represent, is treating every guest with dignity, because it's not just about the people who walk in wearing designer suits and expensive watches, it's about how we treat everyone. A young bellboy. Michael hesitated before stepping forward. He cleared his throat before speaking. Sir, I recognized you. Admitted, his voice careful. I saw you when you walked in. I knew who you were, but I didn't say anything. Keanu studied him for a moment before offering a small nod. Why? Michael hesitated before answering. Because I thought if the manager didn't think you belonged here, then maybe I was wrong. That more than anything seemed to strike the room into deeper silence. Keanu nodded again, his expression unreadable. That's exactly the problem, he said. It's not just about one person's mistake. It's about the culture we create. And that's why things need to change. Victoria shifted. Uncomfortably, she had always prided herself on being a leader, but in this moment she felt anything but. Taking a deep breath, she finally spoke. I was wrong. She admitted, her voice quieter than usual. I let my own assumptions get in the way of my job, and for that I apologize. Keanu gave a small smile, not of triumph, but of understanding. It's not about never making mistakes, he said. It's about learning from them and making sure they don't happen again. The meeting ended with a new training initiative to reshape the hotel's approach to Service 1 that focused not just on high-paying clients, but on creating a culture of true hospitality. And as the employees filed out of the room, Victoria lingered behind, watching as Keanu turned toward the window. Looking out over the city, she had underestimated him. She had underestimated the kind of leader he was, and in doing so, she had almost lost the opportunity to learn the most valuable lesson of her career. The weight of the meeting still hung in the air as the staff filtered out of the conference room, murmuring among themselves. Some looked relieved, others contemplative, and a few still stunned at the unexpected turn of events. Keanu Reeves wasn't just some guest. They had been in the presence of their new boss the entire time. But for Victoria Sinclair, the senior manager who had dismissed him so quickly, their realization was far more personal. She lingered behind, hands clasped in front of her, watching as Keanu stood near the window, gazing out at the illuminated skyline of New York. He had been so calm through it all, never raising his voice, never demanding immediate consequences, and yet the way he handled the situation had made more of an impact than any corporate reprimand could have. Taking a deep breath, she approached him, her usual confidence shaken. Mr. Reeves, she began, cautiously, her voice softer than usual. Keanu turned slightly, his expression unreadable. Victoria, he acknowledged, his tone neutral. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. I want to say thank you, she admitted. Not just for not firing me on the spot, but for handling this the way you did. I know I made a huge mistake. Keanu studied her for a moment before nodding. You did, he said simply. She swallowed hard, bracing herself for what came next. But he continued. You owned up to it. That's the first step. Victoria exhaled, failed some of the tension in her shoulders, easing. I have to ask, she said, glancing around to make sure they were alone. Why didn't you just fire me? Most people in your position wouldn't have even given me the chance to explain myself. Keanu leaned against the window ledge, crossing his arms. Because mistakes don't define people, he said. How they handle them does. She let his words settle for a moment before nodding. I've spent years working in luxury hospitality. I thought I had everything figured out, she admitted, glancing down. But I was wrong. I got so caught up in the exclusivity of this place that I forgot what hospitality is supposed to be about. Keanu gave her a small, knowing smile. Then change it, he said simply. Victoria met his gaze, searching for any sign that this was some kind of test, but all she saw was genuine expectation. He wasn't just giving her a second chance. He was trusting her to make the Regent Crown better than before. I will, she said. And for the first time in a long time, she truly meant it. By the next morning, word had spread across the entire hotel. Employees who had witnessed the previous night's events whispered about how the hotel owner had walked in unrecognized and how the senior manager had nearly kicked him out. But more importantly, a new set of expectations had been established. Richard Morgan, the senior executive, had met with Keanu earlier that morning to discuss the new training initiative, ensuring that every employee from the front desk to housekeeping to upper management would undergo retraining in customer service, inclusion, and professionalism. Victoria was given the responsibility of leading the change, which meant addressing her own mistakes head-on. She spent the morning making direct rounds through the hotel, interacting with staff she had previously overlooked, listening to their concerns and setting a new tone for the workplace. At the front desk, she found Michael, the young bellboy who had recognized Keanu but said nothing. He stood stiffly, clearly unsure how to act. Around her now, Michael, she said, keeping her voice steady. Yes, ma'am, he replied quickly, his posture straightening. She studied him for a moment before sighing. You saw what happened last night. You recognize Mr. Reeves, but you didn't say anything. Why? Michael hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I wanted to, he admitted, but when I saw the way you treated him, I thought maybe I was wrong, that maybe if you, as the manager, thought he didn't belong, then I shouldn't say anything either. Victoria closed Her eyes briefly, the truth of his words hitting her harder than she expected. She had been so consumed with maintaining the hotel's exclusivity that she had unknowingly created a culture where people were afraid to speak up, even when they knew something was wrong. "I put you in a bad position," she admitted, exhaling. "That's on me." Michael blinked, clearly not expecting that response. He hesitated before. Continuing, "I guess. I didn't want to step out of line." Victoria nodded finally, understanding. "Well," she said, offering a small, genuine smile, "that's going to change if you ever see something like that happen again, whether it's with me or anyone else. You speak up." "Understood." Michael's shoulders relaxed slightly, a relieved grin forming. "Yes, ma'am." She gave him a nod before turning back toward the front desk, her next task already forming in her mind. That afternoon, Victoria found Keanu in one of the hotel's private lounges, seated at a table by the window with a cup of coffee. The moment he noticed her approach, he gestured for her to sit busy. He asked, smirking slightly. She exhaled a soft laugh. Understatement. Keanu took a sip of his coffee, before setting the cup down. "So how's it going?" Victoria hesitated before answering. "It's humbling," she admitted, "seeing the way people reacted to what happened last night. Some were surprised, but others, I think they were waiting for something like this to happen, a shakeup." Keanu nodded, as if he already knew the thing about leadership. He said, "Is that it's not about maintaining the way things are. It's about knowing when change is necessary." She absorbed that for a moment before asking, "Why this hotel?" He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you could have bought any hotel a new one without problems, one without managers who misjudge their own boss," she said with a smirk. Though there was an edge of sincerity to her words, Keanu chuckled, but then leaned forward slightly. "Because I believe places like this can be more than just luxury." He said, "It's not just about the chandeliers or the VIP lists. It's about how people feel when they walk in. Do they feel valued? Do they feel welcome?" Victoria nodded slowly. "I think I forgot that along the way." "Well," Keanu said, finishing his coffee. "Good thing you remembered." A moment of silence passed before Victoria finally said, "I won't forget." "Again." Keanu smiled. "That's the goal." She stood up, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I'll see you at the next staff meeting," she said, turning toward the door. "Oh, Victoria," Keanu called after her. She turned back. "Yeah," he grinned. "Maybe don't assume the next casually dressed guy who walks in doesn't belong." She laughed, shaking her head. Lesson learned, Mr. Reeves. And with that, she walked out of the lounge, ready to lead the change she had once resisted. By the end of the week, the Regent Crown Hotel was already different staff. Morale had shifted, the atmosphere had warmed, and the rigid exclusivity that once defined the hotel was now replaced with genuine hospitality. Keanu Reeves may have been the owner, but the real transformation had to come from within. And for Victoria Sinclair, one night's mistake became the turning point of her entire career. She had once prided herself on knowing everything about the hotel business. But now, she was learning what it truly meant to be a leader. The transformation at Regent Crown Hotel had begun, but real change wasn't just about policy updates and meetings. It was about what happened when no one was watching for Victoria Sinclair, the senior manager who had once dismissed Keanu Reeves as an unworthy guest. The real test wasn't in her words, it was in her actions, and she didn't have to wait long for that test to arrive. It was a crisp autumn evening, nearly a week after Keanu's surprise visit, and the hotel was buzzing with its usual energy. Well-dressed business executives filled the lobby, their expensive luggage being carried by attentive bell buoys, while a group of socialites gathered near the lounge, sipping champagne and laughing over hushed conversations. Victoria had just finished reviewing the latest guest satisfaction reports, which for the first time in months showed improvement, when she heard a commotion near the front desk. The tone wasn't aggressive, but there was a familiar edge of condescension, the same tone she had once used on Keanu. Without a second thought, curious, she stepped out from behind the desk, scanning the area. That's when she saw them, two young travelers, a man and a woman, standing awkwardly in front of the reception desk. Their backpacks looked heavy. Their clothes were neat, but clearly well worn. and their shoes carried the unmistakable dust of long-distance travel, and behind the desk, one of her own employees, Lauren, was speaking to them in the same dismissive, tight-lipped manner that Victoria herself had used just days ago. "I'm sorry," Lauren was saying barely, concealing her impatience, "but our rooms require a reservation and a credit card on file. Before check-in, we cater to a specific clientele, and I'm afraid we might not have accommodations that suit your budget." Victoria felt a prickle of shame as she watched the scene unfold. It was almost identical to what had happened between her and Keanu that night. The only difference was that now she was standing on the outside, witnessing the mistake in someone else. The two young travelers exchanged a look, the flicker of embarrassment in their expressions unmistakable. The man shifted his backpack clearly, debating whether they should argue their case or just accept the rejection and leave. But before they could, Victoria stepped forward. "Lauren," she said, her voice steady but firm. The receptionist turned, eyes widening slightly when she saw Victoria standing there. "Oh, Miss Sinclair, I heard Victoria cut in smoothly, then turned to the young couple with a professional yet welcoming smile. "I'm the manager here. Let me see what I can do for you." The two travelers looked hesitant but hopeful. The young man, clearly the more vocal of the two, cleared his throat. "We actually do have a reservation," he said. "It's under Thomas Reed." Victoria motioned for Lauren to check the system. The receptionist did, her expression shifting from certainty to mild embarrassment as the name appeared on the screen. "Oh," she muttered, her cheeks coloring. "You actually do have a reservation." Victoria reined in her frustration, keeping her focus on the real issue. "Thomas, let me personally welcome you to the Regent Crown," she said, extending her hand, which he shook, a little surprised but grateful. "You and your companion are our guests, and we appreciate you choosing to stay with us." Lauren looked mortified. I didn't mean to assume," she stammered. Victoria turned back to her. "But you did," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "And I know that because I made the same mistake myself." Last week, Lauren's eyes widened slightly. She had of course heard the rumors about the night Keanu Reeves had shown up unexpectedly, but she hadn't known the details. And now, standing in the exact same position, she understood. Victoria let the moment sink in before she spoke again. "Every guest who walks through that door is to be treated with the same level of respect, no matter what they wear, what they carry, or how much money you think they have," she said. "Do you understand?" Lauer nodded quickly, her embarrassment turning into determination. "Yes, Miss Sinclair, I do." Victoria gave her a slight nod before returning her attention to Thomas and his companion. "Enjoy your stay. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask." Thomas smiled, and for the first time that night his shoulders relaxed. "Thanks," he said sincerely. As the couple moved toward the elevators, Victoria exhaled softly. The real test hadn't been in the meeting with Keanu Reeves. It had been this moment, the moment when she had the opportunity to act differently than she had before. And this time, she had. Past later that night, Victoria was reviewing the newly adjusted front desk protocols when she received a text from Richard Morgan. "Richard, your favorite guest is back, checking in under a different name this time." Victoria blinked at the message before quickly typing back, "Victoria, you're kidding, Richard, not at all. Lobby right now," without hesitation. Victoria straightened her blazer and hurried toward the front desk. And sure enough, there he was. Keanu Reeves stood at the counter, dressed even more casually than before this time, in a simple black beanie gray t-shirt and jeans. He had no luggage, no entourage, no telltale signs that he was anything more than a regular traveler. And yet this time the staff was handling the situation completely differently. Lauren, still shaken from her earlier mistake, was the one assisting him, but instead of the cold, dismissive tone she had used before, she was polite, welcoming, and professional. "I have a reservation under Jonathan Wick," Keanu said, his lips twitching ever so slightly. Victoria bit back a laugh. Lauren, not recognizing the alias as a joke, simply nodded and typed the name into the system. "Yes, Mr. Wick," she said, her tone completely professional. "Welcome to the Regent Crown. We're happy to have." Keanu smiled at her. Thanks, appreciate it. Lauren handed him the room key, still none the wiser. If you need anything, just let us know. Keanu took. Thiki glanced at Victoria for a brief second, just long enough to see the hidden amusement in her eyes, and then nodded. Will do. He turned and walked toward the elevators, disappearing down the hallway, without a single person treating him any differently than they would any other guest. Victoria exhaled, shaking her head. This time they got it right. She turned to Lauren, who was still oblivious. You did well, she said. Lauren smiled, clearly relieved. Thank you. Miss Sinclair, Victoria smirked, watching as the elevator doors closed behind Keanu. Jonathan Wick. She knew full well that Keanu had just tested them again, and this time the Regent Crown Hotel had passed by. The following week, the Regent Crown felt like a completely different place. The staff, once rigid and selective in their hospitality, had adopted an entirely new mindset. There was still an air of luxury, but now there was also warmth, inclusivity, and genuine hospitality. And it all started with one unexpected guest who refused to be judged by his appearance. Victoria, standing in the lobby watching the flow of guests that evening, felt something she hadn't in years. Pride. Keanu had walked in as a test, but in the end he had done something far more important. He had changed the heart of the Regent Crown Hotel forever. Change is a funny thing. It happened slowly at first, like a distant wave moving toward the shore, but once it reaches land, it crashes with force, reshaping everything in its path. That's what happened at Regent Crown Hotel. The moment Keanu Reeves walked in that night, disguised as just another guest, the old ways of doing things began to unravel. And now the staff had embraced an entirely new culture, one that focused not just on exclusivity, but on genuine hospitality. For Victoria Sinclair, the hotel's senior manager, this shift was personal. She had spent years believing she knew everything about running a high-end establishment, but in the past few weeks she had learned more about leadership, humility, and respect than in her entire career. And tonight that lesson would be put to the ultimate test. The Regent Crown Annual Gala was one of the most prestigious events of the year, a night where the wealthiest clients, investors, and high-profile figures gathered in the hotel's grand ballroom for an evening of elegance, networking, and celebration. The ballroom was breathtaking. Gold chandeliers cast a soft glow across the polished floors. Waiters in crisp uniforms carried trays of champagne, and a live orchestra played smooth jazz in the background. Guests arrived in designer gowns and tailored suits, their conversations filled with investment deals and luxury travel plans. Victoria, dressed in a sleek black evening dress, moved through the crowd, ensuring everything was running smoothly. She was proud of how her staff handled the event. Even the new hires, some of whom had struggled with the transition, were now treating every guest with warmth and professionalism regardless of their appearance. And then, just as she was about to check in with Richard Morgan, the hotel's senior executives, something unexpected happened. A man entered the ballroom, alone, dressed casually and completely out of place. He wore an old tweed jacket, slightly worn dress shoes, and a button-up shirt that had seen better days. His hair was graying, his face weathered, and he carried a simple leather briefcase. Immediately, the energy in the room shifted. Some guests glanced at him, confused, whispering among themselves. Others simply ignored him, assuming he had wandered in by mistake. Victoria felt the tension immediately. It was a moment of déjà vu, a reflection of the night Keanu had walked in and been dismissed, but this time she wasn't going to let history repeat itself. She stepped forward, approaching the man with the same warm professionalism she had learned to embody. "Good evening, sir," she said with a welcoming smile. "Welcome to the Regent Crown Annual Gala. How can I assist you?" The man hesitated, as if expecting her to turn him away. I was invited," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a slightly crumpled invitation. Victoria took it, gently scanning it before nodding. "Of course, Mr. Preston, we're honored to have you." His shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying the kind of gratitude that only someone who had been dismissed before could truly understand. She turned to one of the waiters. "Please bring Mr. Preston a drink and ensure he has everything he needs." The young waiter, who had once been one of the more hesitant employees when it came to the new policies, nodded immediately. Yes, ma'am, right away. Victoria smiled. Enjoy the evening, Mr. Preston, as he walked further into the ballroom. The whispers and glances faded. The staff, seeing how their manager had treated him with the same level of respect as every other guest, followed suit. No assumptions, no dismissals, just hospitality. Unbeknownst to Victoria, Keanu had been watching the entire exchange from across the room, dressed in a classic black suit. He blended in effortlessly with the rest of the high-profile guests. But unlike them, he wasn't here to make business deals or socialize. He was here to see if the Regent Crown had truly changed, and what he had just witnessed proved that it had. Richard Morgan, standing beside him, let out a low whistle. She's really stepped up, he murmured, watching as Victoria continued overseeing the event with ease that could have gone very differently. Keanu nodded, taking a sip of his drink. She gets it now. Richard chuckled. Are you gonna tell her you saw that? Keanu smiled. Nope. Richard laughed. You really enjoy testing people, don't you? Keanu shrugged. I prefer to call it trusting them to do the right thing. Later that evening, after the gala had begun to wind down, Victoria stepped outside onto the hotel's rooftop terrace. Needing a moment to breathe, the cool night air was refreshing and the city light stretched endlessly before her. She was proud of how the night had gone, but more than that, she was proud of how far she had come. A voice behind her broke the silence. Not bad. Sinclair. She turned, startled only to see Keanu leaning against the railing, hands in his pockets. You saw? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Keanu smirked. I see everything. She exhaled a soft laugh, shaking her head. Well, did I pass? Keanu studied her for a moment before nodding. Yeah, you did, she smiled, but then grew serious. I almost didn't, though. A few weeks ago, I would have done exactly what Lauren did at the front desk. I would have assumed, I would have dismissed. Keanu nodded. But you didn't. Victoria looked out at the skyline. People think change is about big moments, but it's really about the small ones, isn't it? Keanu tilted his head slightly. It's about the choices you make when you think no one's watching. She glanced at him, realizing that's exactly what he had done to her. He had given her the chance to make the right choice, not because she was being watched, but because it was the right thing to do. She nodded. Well, thanks for the lesson, Mr. Reeves. Keanu smirked anytime she crossed her arms, glancing at him suspiciously. You're not going to pull another test on me, are you? Keanu grinned. Wouldn't dream of it. Victoria rolled her eyes. You're lying, he chuckled. Maybe she laughed, shaking her head. Good night, Keanu. He gave her a nod, then turned toward the door. Good night, Victoria. As he walked away, she exhaled, smiling to herself. Because this time she didn't need a test to know she had changed. She just knew the Regent Crown Hotel would never be the same. Not because of new policies, not because of corporate mandates, but because of a shift in culture, one where respect, kindness, and true hospitality came first. And all it had taken was one unexpected guest who refused to be judged by his appearance, and a manager who finally understood what it truly meant to lead. The Regent Crown Hotel had changed, not just on the surface, not just in policy, but in the way it felt. The way people were treated the moment they walked through its grand revolving doors. Respect wasn't something reserved for those who looked the part. It was now a standard, a core value embedded into every interaction. And the best part, it wasn't just the staff that noticed. Regular guests, the ones who had been coming to the hotel for years, began to feel the shift. The exclusivity was still there, but the air of quiet judgment was gone. Visitors who once felt like they had to prove themselves before receiving basic hospitality now felt welcome from the moment they arrived. For Keanu Reeves, the new majority stakeholder of the hotel, this was exactly what he had hoped for. He had come in with a test, but what had come out of it was something far more meaningful. Real change led by someone who had once been the problem, but had since become the solution. And for Victoria Sinclair, the hotel's senior manager, that realization hit her in an unexpected way. It was a week after the gala, and Victoria had just finished reviewing the final details of a new employee onboarding program when she received a message from Richard Morgan. Richard, you should come down to the lobby. You'll want to see this. Frowning, Victoria tucked her phone away and headed downstairs. As she approached, she saw Richard standing near the front desk, arms crossed, smirking slightly. "What's going on?" she asked Richard. Nodded toward the entrance. "Looks familiar, doesn't it?" Victoria turned and froze. A man had just walked through the doors, middle-aged, wearing a faded button-up kaross and scuffed shoes. He carried a single duffel bag over his shoulder and had the unmistakable expression of someone who didn't quite believe they belonged. A week ago, maybe even a month ago, this man would have been dismissed, but tonight, Victoria didn't have to step in because her staff had already changed. She watched as Lauren, the receptionist, who'd once made the same mistake, she had greeted the man with a warm, genuine smile. "Welcome to Regent Crown, sir," she said kindly. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" The man hesitated, clearly surprised by how he was being treated. No, actually," he admitted. "I was just hoping to see if you had any availability." Lauren nodded without missing a beat. "Of course, let me check for you." Victoria exhaled, smiling slightly. Richard nudged her. "I'd say Thellison stuck, wouldn't you?" Victoria glanced at him, then back at her staff, who were treating every guest exactly the way they should. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think it did." Keanu had given them a test and they had passed the next morning. Keanu checked out of the Regent Crown Hotel just as quietly as he had arrived. He hadn't made a grand statement about his departure. He hadn't called for a final meeting. He didn't need to as he approached the front desk. Michael, the young bellboy who had hesitated the first time he saw him, greeted him. Confidently, "Mr. Reeves," Michael said, with a knowing smile. "I hope you enjoyed your stay." Keanu chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "I think this is the first time someone's actually called me by my real name when I checked in." Michael shrugged playfully. "Well, if you ever need another alias. I hear Jonathan Wick works pretty well." Keanu laughed, noted Lauren handed him his final bill, her confidence completely different from the first time she had seen him. "Everything is taken care of, sir. And I just want to say thank you for everything." Keanu met her gaze, then looked around the lobby one last time. He could feel the difference in the air, in the way people carried themselves, in the way they respected each other. He smiled. "You guys did this," he said, "not me." Victoria walked over just as he picked up his bag, leaving without saying goodbye. She teased Keanu, smirked, "Didn't think I needed to. You've got things under control now." Victoria nodded, understanding still, she said, extending her hand. "Thanks for making me better at my job," Keanu shook her hand. "Thanks for proving me right." She smirked. "About what that people can change," he said simply. And with that, he turned and walked through the revolving doors, this time as a guest who had left something far more valuable behind than just a name on a reservation. He had left behind a legacy. This story leaves us with one simple question. Have you ever judged someone too quickly, only to realize later how wrong you were? Or maybe, like Victoria, you've been the one who had to learn the hard way that real leadership isn't about control, it's about respect. If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter who they are or what they look like, comment yes below. And if you want to hear more inspiring stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because sometimes the smallest moments teach us the biggest lessons. See you in the next story.